Good morning. I can't hear you.
Did Dad have a good birthday?
Oh, yes. Yes,
Good.
you did.
Yeah, I didn't see the little pop-up about my audio. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, Madeline. Hey, Derek.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How about you guys?
How's it going?
Not too shabby, not too shabby.
I was expecting a little more snow today, but no such luck.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
I work at the laundromat downtown, and I work in the afternoon and the woman who works in the mornings is like, I'm not coming in tomorrow. The snow's gonna be so bad. And I was like, oh, okay. So I put a sign on the door that was like, oh, not coming in tomorrow. And now I'm like, I think it's enough snow for people to come in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Laundry and whatnot.
I guess it's hit or miss, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think I might go into the office a little later as well. As long as the roads have been treated.
Yeah. I feel like people are a little gun shy too from like last week's snow.
Yeah.
The week before.
Yeah. Everybody's delayed this morning. We got a small crew. Hopefully we'll have a larger group. So the group that's on right now, have you guys worked up your proposal? I went on and I only saw there were 4 for your topic, your research topic. Are you still kind of mulling it over?
I submitted mine.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
I'm still working on mine a little bit, but I should get it in soon though.
Okay. Let's throw out some topics so we make sure we don't have any duplicates. So Derek, what were you thinking you wanted to do your paper on? You don't know yet?
Still not sure, yeah.
Okay. Are you thinking animal, plant?
Probably be a plant.
Okay. Plant and maybe some kind of issue as opposed to like, I'm going to focus on the, Hawaiian silver sword type thing. Although if it's an endangered plant, you may kind of give us an array of information about it. But sometimes, things, topics that impact plants generally, and maybe like regional plants, for example, like in today's lecture, if we get to that slide, how the border wall is impacting the survival of an endangered cactus, the night blooming cereus, which the pollinators are not passing very well across the border. So things like that, some kind of environmental impact that might affect a plant or an animal may be an option as opposed to just, again, like a book report about a plant or an animal. So maybe approach it that way, you guys, if you feel like your focus is so narrow. And then other people have done kind of a comparative thing. So they'll pick kind of a plant and an animal, like a plant and a pollinator, and see how they're impacted. Or they'll pick a region and kind of talk about the conservation crisis or focus in that region of the country or the world. So anyway, I was thinking like if you do rhinos, and I'm not Tierney, I didn't get a chance to look yet, but what was your topic? You didn't pick rhino, did you?
No, I was gonna do like the Galapagos species that are like, because there's a couple species that are endangered, I believe.
Yep, yep. So that region definitely, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things, climate change and ecotourism, you know, impacts and
Yeah.
things like that. So you can kind of approach it from a multifaceted standpoint. Reagan, what were you thinking?
I'm still kind of unsure.
Okay.
Where do we turn it in exactly? Because I'm
Yep. There's a
wasn't
the
sure.
whole Dropbox section at the bottom of our Moodle site. So I'll kind of show you guys, I'll share screen.
Oh, okay, I see it now.
Yeah, just for a refresher for everyone, right? So here's our top where your zooms and stuff are, where our units are. And then right down here, we've got the rubric. So the rubric is in there for the proposal, let you know what I'd like to see in it. And then your Dropbox is for your article presentations, and the final project proposal Dropbox would be right here. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I was
Yeah, and
looking down there and I just kind of missed it while I was looking.
no, it's okay. It's all right if you need a refresher. So the reason why I say that is I'm hopping back over here to our daily kind of schedule. And coming down the pike, we've got the annotated term paper and the annotated bibliography for the term paper. And I can give an extension on that. That's not a problem, but I just want to keep us on track, right? So I can make an adjustment, make a shift to give you guys a little extra time. But the longer you wait on dropping your proposal in and getting the okay from me, the harder it'll be for you to have enough time to kind of really get a decent chunk of literature for the annotated bibliography, okay? So don't delay too long. I would say in the next day or two, make sure you work that up. It's only about a page, but at least that way I can dialogue with you, make sure you're on the right track. Sound good?
Yeah, should we like email you or like we don't want to have the same, topic.
Right, yeah. So not everybody, Tierney's going to do Galapagos. Derek's a little uncertain, but may lean plants. Madeline, you had mentioned, what are you thinking?
I submitted a proposal, but I don't know if it's if it fits the category. I was gonna do like industrial farming's impact on biodiversity. Is that too?
Yeah, that would work. Yep. What I will do is I will put a little Google sheet up there, and if you've already submitted, I can put your topic in there with your name, and then if you haven't yet, you can click on it and add that to it, just so you can double check and make sure nobody's taken your topic. And so Regan, you're a little uncertain as well, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna try to get it done like today or tomorrow.
Okay. Devin, any thoughts on what you're gonna be working up?
I already submitted a proposal for the conservation of the European mink.
Oh, excellent. Very focused.
And I was looking for an animal that was relatively broad and also cute.
Yeah, so this one
As I
really,
was just digging through the red list,
yeah.
and I found that one. There was a lot of issues associated with it, so I was like, I can probably get enough content out of that.
Yeah. So if you find that you're going down a rabbit hole of too much focus, you could maybe broaden it out to mustelids or fur-bearing species in general. Or if that species is found in another location, you could kind of compare and contrast management in those two locations. So, but that sounds interesting. Naomi, what are you thinking?
I'm not sure yet. I think I have to narrow things down a bit.
Okay. And Austin, had you nailed something down?
I was thinking about something to do with like biodiversity of big cats, like cheetah populations and stuff, but I'm not positive yet.
My dog, I'm sorry. He did a weird sound. Yeah, all of these sound great, like great topics, you guys. So I would say, work that proposal up. And I just wanted to get a decent size, number before I dove into them. I'll give you a little bit of feedback and maybe some suggestions on sources, and then you can be on your way to kind of doing what I mentioned in the beginning, which was to try and maybe install, if you don't use Zotero, it might be useful to install Mendeley. And then, don't forget to install the plugin for Chrome and the plugin for Microsoft Word. So it'll be very easy for you to, be on Google Scholar and, oh, look, up in my right-hand corner, I've got that icon which I'm gonna point to right here. The dog is like elbowing me. This little Mendeley thing right here. So you open up your document, you click on that link, and it brings it into your library. And it'll be, very easy for you to be working even on your annotated bibliography using that, okay? So anyway, just wanted to bring that up. Again, this week, we're gonna be covering biodiversity and extinction. Nothing for discussion today, except ideally, after I finish new conservation, I'm gonna turn the mic over to Austin, if Austin's okay with that, to work through his handout on birds. It fits in well, actually, with the extinction discussions that we're having. And then for next time we meet, you guys should peruse these 4 articles. And I did send out an email with the people that were, in charge of those articles. So those folks are going to do their, their handout, drop it in the Dropbox, and then present on Thursday. Okay. Any questions on the logistics? All right. I want to, and again, yeah, here's the Dropbox for that final proposal. I only had 4 of them, so I wanted to kind of make sure you had that. Oh goodness, my kids are complaining about silly things. Okay, old and new conservation. I want to finish this. Excuse me, Rowan, I'm on a Zoom. Then you go talk to Daddy upstairs. I'm sorry, guys. All right, let me share this screen. I think you guys can see it. Okay, so I really want us to kind of be able to put this topic to bed. And it's really important that we think about conservation in these 2 camps, okay? And that's, again, why we had that quiz at the very beginning, to think about these topics. So we did start talking about old school conservation. Remember, Soule, the father of conservation, 1985, when this all kind of began, and his concern. So there's 2 articles, the Soule and the Doak article, that are very kind of pro old school conservation. And then Kariba and Marvier, they're the ones that are kind of focusing on the new conservation. All right, so big take home topics. In Soule's articles, his concerns are that this is our focus in new conservation: economic development, getting rid of poverty, corporate sponsorships, and this, high standard of living that that Kariba thinks is going to then garner this deeper affection for nature. And again, these are all the associations, the big one being the, Nature Conservancy, that is kind of promoting this idea that we should, buddy up with our companies, and we should focus on humans first. And so Soule says here, instead of pursuing protection of biodiversity for biodiversity's sake, new conservation seek to enhance natural systems that benefit the wider number of people, especially the poor. The dog, I'm sorry, the dog is eating my papers. I can't win today with everybody's revolting. Look at this.
Yeah, you can't catch a break.
No, I'm sorry about that. So, he's basically, concerned that, we're losing touch with that preservationist ethic that we had talked about. Okay. New conservation says biodiversity is not in touch with economic realities. The old school conservation is not in touch with like things going on now. They're stuck in 85. The new conservation, and again, I mentioned this, says that national parks and reserves are for the elite, right? Only the wealthy folks that have that luxury of taking vacations are going to go to these national parks. Soule, again, his big concern is, if we get more wealthy, we're going to have larger ecological footprints. We're just going to buy more. And, that old school conservation is worried that if we lose biodiversity, if we stop preserving biodiversity for biodiversity's sake, we're going to have less species richness, less resilience, and we're going to be in trouble when it comes time for disturbances to occur and climate change and whatnot, right? So Soule's comment here, is important to note, because maybe you guys donate to these foundations, right? Finally, I believe those who donate to conservation organizations do so in full confidence that their gifts are going to benefit wild creatures and habitats. Think about it. You get that mailing in the mail, the free stickers, the free bookmark, the free, labels with your address from these organizations wanting you to kind of donate every year. You think that you're putting it towards, habitat restoration or setting aside money for preserves and feeding these animals and maybe even captive breeding programs, but really it's going towards kind of forming these partnerships with corporations, right? So, he says here, whether monies are donated to Nature Conservancy or other conservation nonprofits, they should be spent for the nature protection or should be diverted to other things like humanitarian economic development projects, such as those who profited from this new conservation dubious expenditures and so on and so forth. So traditional conservationists don't demand humanitarians stop helping the poor, but the humanitarian-driven new conservationists should demand that nature not be protected for its own sake, but it be protected only if it materially benefits human beings. So he has these worries, right? He's really concerned that we've lost the focus on the organisms, right? So Doak comes in and lays out a whole series of concerns and issues as well, right? The new conservation folks marginalize the inherent value of nature, the sentient nature, right? Human-centered conservation ethic. They're not protecting nature for nature's sake, right? New conservation says the old conservation folks, they've focused on biodiversity, but they forgot about humans, right? And that's a problem. New conservation also says that the old school folks said, nature is fragile, it's not resilient, right? And they say, no, it's very resilient. It can bounce back all the time. The new guys also are saying those parks have failed, right? We still keep losing a whole bunch of species, right? Even if we're protecting and putting more lands in preserves and growing our, land trusts, we are still losing species, so they're not helpful. And they also say that we really have lost, the old school folks have lost social responsibility. They're focused on the white minority. They're not focused on what the poor are experiencing. And then also finally, new conservation wants to focus on urban areas, preserving urban areas, because that's where, humans would benefit the most. So parks and whatnot. So Doak lays out all these things that, new conservation believes, and then comes back with this retort. Oh no, he said, they say, that old school conservation has been focusing on humans and biodiversity all along, and I can show you why. And so he puts this visual in here, right? The area in millions set aside by the National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Fish and U.S. Forest Service, and the Bureau of Land Management, okay? And it's broken up in two parts. Those lands set aside just for wilderness, so for the plants and animals, so the old school kind of, biodiversity protections are the red, and the blue are for humans and recreation and, other things. So, the fact that new conservation is saying there was always a focus on the organisms and not the humans is not true. It may vary organization by organization. Notice the National Park Service. You're not supposed to do anything in the parks, right? If you guys have traveled, you can't take rocks, right? You can't hunt in the parks, in these national parks. There's a lot of restriction, but there is still a focus on recreation and other things. So there's a large amount of focus and energy, the land and monies going towards preserving biodiversity, but there's also some going towards, the experience that humans are going to have there. As we move towards sort of these other organizations, the Bureau of Land Management is like, you can hunt, you can camp, you can drive through, you have access to these lands. So there's, again, more focus on what humans can do on these lands and less on the protection of these other organisms, okay? So again, just reminding everybody that you have to not be so kind of broad about it. You can kind of look across and see that, yes, we have been doing this all along. We have been bringing the human in as well. Old school, the argument that, you know, the parks are useless, that we just keep losing these organisms, isn't necessarily true either, because we've slowed the rate of extinction in many cases. So, you know, it's not been for nothing. And then, you know, OC positions that there's not really a way for you to kind of increase economic benefit and at the same time increase your ecological benefit. It's one of those kind of moral residue things. You can't do one and the other. That's kind of their realistic argument there. Now, the new conservationists do say, you know, you guys maybe overstepped, right? When you made these parks, which were meant to kind of preserve biodiversity, you were forsaking other humans, right? So they've basically said you created conservation refugees, right? You went into these parks, these lands that you wanted to set aside, and you displaced Native Americans. So the OC agrees in part. You know, they say, yes, this did happen, but they have been working with them ever since to try and have alliances and work towards protecting some of the lands and sacred areas, okay, like, you know, Bears Ears and stuff. So that's sort of their argument, that you can't be so short-sighted, new conservationists. We've been doing some of this stuff all along, and we've been trying to work to mitigate, right? Kareva's stance really is this, as we switch over to those articles, right? Old school conservation believes we're dealing with a crisis discipline, okay? And because there's that urgency, these are all crises, they will often approach these decisions without all the information. You have to, because you only have a handful of organisms left, right? And that's sort of the triage thing that you guys were covering, right? New conservation says there's only a few saviors that are out there kind of doing this work in old school conservation. They're led by their own conservation ethics, not necessarily that for everyone else. And they put biodiversity over human livelihood, okay? So this is kind of a diagram of what old school conservation is influenced by. And this would be the ethic that the new conservation is moved by, okay? These new conservation folks say that times have changed, right? And we are aware of that. The human population has increased. We have, you know, consumed a lot of stuff. But even during this whole time, we've been putting more lands aside, more lands and waters aside for protection. New conservation is also really aware that there is a disconnect of humans and nature, right? This nature deficit disorder. They, you know, reviewed surveys, and it's kind of sad. But, you know, kids recognize corporate logos, but they don't recognize plant species. What I have found interesting with, you know, my boys is, did you guys ever play Pokemon?
Yeah.
Yep.
Right?
Still do.
Yeah, so there's this, you know, when you look at the Pokemon cards and you see the evolution and you look at the names, you can tell that they're reaching towards like the real names, right? Or they're looking at taxa, or they're thinking about, you know, I forget what they're called, a rock type and a plant type or something. But the kids are, you know, even though it's kind of fantastical, they're learning a little bit along the way, and they're seeing how these things evolve, you know, new adaptations and stuff. So yes, there's a decline in, you know, nature readings and, you know, stories that are specifically about, you know, the muskrats or, you know, Peter Cottontail. You see fewer of those things being published and more you know, like Legos and Ninjago and stuff like that. But you know, some of those classics are still there, you know, but new conservation's aware of that. If we're going to have leaders in conservation moving forward, we have to figure out a way to bring that back in, okay? So new conservation's basic tenets are pristine nature is no longer. We live in the Anthropocene, right? And so we can't have this fortress conservation. We can't just put all the energy into parks, right? We can't put all the money into preserving these parks where biodiversity is going to be plentiful and the experience is going to be that, you know, overwhelming kind of religious experience. We can't do that, right? We have touched everywhere. And the reason why we have to focus in these urban areas maybe is that people are going to be living there. and we have to take care of them. So, I mean, even in these areas, right, if we can protect a village from flooding, right, and if we focus on it from the human perspective, then we reduce the amount of ecological damage that will be occurring as well. So approaching it from how do we save humans is also going to be good for the environment, right? We don't want to have these massive floods. And again, nature is resilient. So the examples that they gave, I thought were quite interesting here, right? So from this article, and I pulled just this excerpt right here. You guys remember when that massive hurricane swept through Puerto Rico and the islands, like devastated so much of the forests, right? It was a couple years ago. Near total, deforestation of Puerto Rico is a good example of nature's resilience. This is the new conservationist saying this. On the basis of species area curves, one can predict that denuding or removing all the vegetation from those Puerto Rican forests should have caused forest birds to dwindle to only 1 or 2 species. However, bird fauna remained almost completely intact because many of them found refuge in coffee plantations and because the forests regrew before they went to extinction. So again, the resiliency of nature and the adaptability, we saw this with the orangutans, right? They're doing okay in those palm fields. And so we have to kind of acknowledge that. Also up here, there was a Gallup poll that was put forth. So back in the 80s, they had these questions about conservation, right? 61% of survey respondents prioritized the environment over economy. That same survey was given in 2011, just like you guys are going to get, pre and post quiz, right? At the beginning you took. Now there's only 36% of people that would prioritize the environment over the economy. So there has been a huge shift in thinking, right? So maybe these new conservationists have something. Their ideas continued, right? Human communities can avoid tragedy of the commons. How? We're going to let the locals regulate plants and animals, ecosystem services on their own. We're not going to get involved. They know what's best, right? They're not going to be the demise of their, civilization, right? If we let them know, fishermen, right? You probably heard of this. If fishermen decide when they need to kind of slow their take, that has saved many fisheries over time, right? And then also this idea of the flat world, okay, that we are globalized, we are all connected. It's not a rounded world where it's hard, to get from one place to the other. We think of it as flat. It's very easy for us to hop on a plane and get places. And so we can't make decisions unilaterally. We have to be involved in, international treaties and working together. We can't solve climate if we just make a change with emissions. We have to do it, we have to get everybody on board or else it's not going to make a dent. So the next steps, we're going to have to conserve places where humans live. We're going to have to get people on board with this, right? We're going to have to bring kids in, and we need to alleviate poverty. This is kind of an interesting thing here. I think I mentioned it maybe over here. We have to support the mission, right? The people have to get involved because otherwise they won't recognize that it's going to benefit them in the long run and it's only harming them. And then we have to work with the corporations. Corporations are keystone species. I think this is an important thing for us to keep in mind. I think they have something here, right? As we read this over here, a reality has to be faced. Corporations drive much of what happens to our lands and waters. Think about Coca-Cola, right, and Pepsi. I'm going to escape out of this so I can see this side here, right? So one cannot expect corporations to go away, nor would anyone who cared about people's lives want them to. Therefore, part of the solution is to work with them to improve practices. However, conservationists are prone to vilifying large corporations and rejecting attempts by conservation organizations to work with them. So if we thought of them as keystone species, right, they take so much, right? Think about what those larger corporations have done to kind of water systems out west, the bottling companies and so on, right? But if we could somehow work with them, perhaps we can, make some major change, right? And then again, human rights and so on and so forth. So finally, kind of moving forward here, this is just reiteration. Yosemite, Yellowstone, these national parks, right? That John Muir, and others, those preservationists that we talked about, had set aside for all the wonder. the Winnebago Mohawk Native Americans, Miwok Native Americans displaced, right? Those conservation refugees. In one day, 300 Shoshone were killed in one day during a forced eviction of an area to put that land towards Yellowstone National Park. Again, conservation refugees and such loss, right? Same is being done in Africa for under the guise of conservation. So new conservation again wants us to focus on the anthropogenic stuff, working landscapes, plantations, urban areas. And the reason they say that is if you don't get people involved, bad things are going to happen, worse things are going to happen, right? In Indonesia, this non-government agency that protected orangutans by stopping deforestation in these reserves. And then now, kind of after this has all happened, they've got illegal logging, even worse now than what it was before. So they tried to help and it made things worse. Why? Because they didn't get the people on board, right? There wasn't that education, that connection to see how it helps them. So again, nature, the new conservation, nature's not fragile. It's very resilient. Basically saying Rachel Carson got it wrong. Al Gore got it wrong. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment got it wrong. Like things are okay. We're not destroying everything and ecosystem functioning is still occurring. Their examples, we lost the American chestnut, we lost the passenger pigeon. We didn't see like the whole world collapse as a result of that, right? There was resiliency, there was functional redundancy. You can go to places where there were oil spills and where, Chernobyl, these reactors leaked, right? These massive disasters. And 72% ecosystem functioning restored, right? We've got these habitats that are becoming occupied by organisms, increasing biodiversity in these cities. Raptors on skyscrapers, bats under the bridges, right? We didn't lose the orangutan because we deforested. This is what they're saying, new conservationists. We lost them because of bushmeat, right? So the idea of bushmeat, which we'll talk about down the line in class, is that the locals will eat wildlife species because that's, like us hunting deer around here, right? It's abundant, it's near them, and they need to eat. And as a result, they can take a little bit too much in some cases. So dealing with poverty, dealing with famine, dealing with those societal issues in these villages will then allow them to not infringe on the biodiversity in their area, right? So all of these things are important to note. Okay, so I wanted us to kind of have a clear head: old school conservation, new conservation, and there's pros and cons. Maybe you're finding like you kind of are walking the line between the two. I see that there's merit in both, and so throughout the semester we'll be thinking about those kinds of ideas. Okay, all right. So I'm going to move on to Austin's discussion. Okay, Austin, can I share screen with you? Do you have that available?
Let me check real quick.
Okay.
No.
Okay. So you want me to advance through it? You put it in the Dropbox?
Yes, it should be in the Dropbox.
Okay. You want it in the PowerPoint form?
Yeah, that'll work fine.
Okay. Beautiful.
All right.
Okay,
Yeah,
go for it.
Okay, so my article was on the decline of North American avifauna. And it talked about the loss of biodiversity and tons of different species that was like studied in the article. It was loss of habitat, climate change, irregulated harvest, lack of knowledge of the species and what's happening in their ecosystems, pollution, and then the decelerating loss of biodiversity is one of the main challenges of the 21st century. All right, so the population change evaluation process, they used 529 bird species in US and Canada They drew from multiple standardized bird monitoring systems and the range-wide population data analysis, projected a 48-year population trajectory, used 143 weather radars to estimate nocturnal migration patterns and passages, and they used NextRad to provide a tool to unmatch the temporal and spatial extent to the study. So the results of this was pretty crazy for me. It was 2.9 billion birds net loss across all biomes. The NextRad also produced a decline figure in the nocturnal migration patterns. The grassland birds showed the largest magnitude of population decrease. More than 700 breeding individuals were lost during this that they recorded. All forest biomes experienced a net reduction of more than 1 billion birds, and the shorebirds are experiencing steep population loss, and that was with the migration patterns as well. We did see an increase, however, in wetland birds. Among the only species to increase, they increased by 13%, and that was followed by waterfowl species with a 56% net increase.
Yeah. So I
And
wanted to just
those-
pause here, right? Let's take a look at these beautiful visuals, right? I think maybe frame C is the most effective in driving home this take-home message. So the change since 1970s in percent, a negative change. Anything to the left, right, is
Yep.
bad, right? So as we look at these names up top, these are a lot of, like what you said, the grassland songbirds, right?
Yep.
What's doing okay are the waterfowl, as you mentioned, vireos, which are pretty adaptive, and raptors. Okay, so maybe the raptors, maybe it's tied into what's going on with their prey. But really kind of interesting. And over here, introduced, you know, shorebirds and so on and so forth. So some really good visuals, and you can kind of see it broken out here. The sparrows are maybe taking a big hit, blackbirds and warblers.
Yeah, I'm gonna mention it later. Well, this is also a decrease in the bird populations, just showed in like a large scale graph, just the amount of decrease that's happening. But I also was gonna mention that like with the waterfowl and all those species that are increasing, I was just wondering if it has to do with like the conservation efforts.
Right.
People
Yeah.
are putting more effort into, like, I know people love hunting waterfowl, so are we putting more effort into those species than we're putting into the grassland species?
Yeah, and I would totally agree with you. You know, if you're going to want to hunt, or if you are, you know, a bird watcher, you go to those wetlands, you go to those wildlife management areas. You might contribute money to support that, but not many people go out to the meadow,
Yep.
you know, to do a lot of that stuff. The wetland is kind of known for its biodiversity. But yeah, I also wanted to say, as we look at this picture, guys, in your mind, you might like be thinking, oh yeah, you know, amphibians are in a lot of trouble. Mammals, we can't even find them before they go extinct, right? And so we know that over time we would expect, because of, you know, chytrid fungus and climate change, that the amphibians are declining, and you've probably heard of that, but maybe it's less common for you to hear that the birds are in trouble. So this paper was really, really an important one. Any take homes on this graph over here by habitat?
We're seeing that again, that the wetland species are the habitats increasing with like increased possible conservation efforts, and then all the um less known about, I would say less educated about species are declining again,
Yeah.
such as the grassland species and like the forest species.
Yep.
And like I mentioned, like this is like a long overlooked problem. It started in the 1970s. The population loss is not only in endangered and threatened species, but also the more abundant species experiencing massive population decrease. They're not endangered yet, but they're decreasing by so much. We're not sure what's going to happen in the next 10 years. Without close examination, a species can be wiped out in a short amount of time relative to even large population size. We're seeing this in the passenger pigeon. I also have an article that's about the passenger pigeon from 3 billion to 0. You also just mentioned that like the resilience of ecosystems. Nothing was really, like when you look up passenger pigeon, the first thing that comes up is the increased knowledge of like the danger of having a species so large can go extinct so fast if we don't put effort into saving it.
Mhm.
but we didn't see a huge. There wasn't like crazy compilation or I'm blanking on the word right now. It wasn't.
Like consequences that followed when we lost them?
Yep.
Yeah.
And then the multiple interacting threats pose a threat to the avifauna, and we must act if we're going to be able to counteract this decline in the future.
Yeah.
These are just some of the similar articles that I found: silent skies, passenger pigeon, and then steep declines for the bird species all across North America and into Canada. I'm not sure if you want.
Yeah, that's terrific. What I was going to say to you guys, I don't know if you noticed, and Austin, I'm going to kind of use you here because you're the guinea pig, the first one going. It looks like, did you put together a Word document as well?
Yes, that's like for the handout portion.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I'm going to bring it up just so everybody can see it. But what I want to make mention of, and well done, by the way, that was great. Great take homes. You guys saw how he pulled some really good figures to kind of explain things, and those other articles at the end if you want to embellish those things. But what I want to just reinforce is you don't need to do both. You could do one or the other. The way that you present it, I would just choose one way or the other, so you don't have to spend a ton of time, preparing two presentations. It looks like a lot of the content is on here as well.
Yeah.
Right. So whatever way you guys want to go, you don't have to make a PowerPoint and a handout. It's really just your preference and how you want to present it. Did you have any questions here that you wanted to pose to the class, or did we cover them in our discussion?
We pretty much covered them talking about it. Like if you guys want to mention anything about what you think about the high risk of the species or the ability for us to bring the numbers back. I'm not sure. Like,
yeah. What I would say is, I don't know about you guys, but I feel like Austin's explanation for why the waterfowl are doing better is on point, right? Have you heard about the wood duck and black duck? Why the wood ducks were in trouble? Anybody know anything about wood ducks?
I know that hunting them, they went from like 5 a day to like 1 a day in a year.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure exactly.
Yeah, wood ducks are cavity nesting birds, and over time, the swampy wetland habitats had declined, and so they were losing their cavity nesting trees. In addition, they were being outcompeted by other more kind of aggressive waterfowl, so mallards and whatnot. And I believe there also were instances of hybridization with wood and black ducks. And so kind of an introgression of genes, which is concerning. But there's been a lot of protections. There have been a lot of, you've probably been to marshes where they have nest boxes that have been installed on poles, right? And it's to help give them more cavities for them to nest, to be able to, rear their offspring, hatch the eggs and have them fledge and so on. So there's been a lot of money, put towards enhancing habitat for these wood ducks and, doing habitat management for them. So they have definitely improved their scenario. Now the raptors doing well is kind of surprising. What are some of the concerns? And Tierney, maybe because she's had class, the wildlife class, but what are some of the concerns with raptors? Anybody? Why would they have been declining but now doing well?
Wasn't it like lead hunting bullets?
Yeah. So if you think about, eagles and some other, larger birds, any sort of, and this would be true, I guess, of waterfowl too, ammunition, lead ammunition causing such, problems. Once those animals are shot, that bird isn't consumed, or taken immediately, other animals are going to be feeding off of it and eating the lead, and it biomagnifying and causing these kind of problems with their brains and whatnot. What about, raptors eat rodents, right?
Yep.
Does that link anything? Does anyone thinking about what's going on with rodents? How are we dealing with rodents?
So that'd be like the the chemicals and everything.
Yeah, yeah. So, right, we put rat poison all over the place, right? You have a camp, you stick rat poison underneath it. You have a barn, you know, who cares? You're not going to relocate and set Sherman traps and relocate these animals. So they're getting poisoned. And the raptors are eating these poisoned rodents. And so there was a massive decline in raptors due to the use of these, you know, these basically like it affects their blood. And as a result, you know, these animals are getting poisoned kind of on up the food chain. But there's been a big, huge campaign to reduce that, the use of that. So I think that's really helped the raptors too.
Yeah, I know it's illegal to use lead shot if you're hunting
Mhm.
waterfowl of any
Mhm.
species now.
Yeah, yeah,
And then I think it's still legal for small game. However,
yeah. Yeah, and nobody's hunting. Like, it's not an explanation for the decline in the songbirds. Nobody's hunting the songbirds.
yeah, no,
But they're losing their habitat is what's happening, right? So yeah, that's helping. That's, you know, causing that decline on their side. Great job with that. Um, all right, any last minute thoughts, questions on that story? Okay. Well, it kind of it leads us right into biodiversity, right? We just saw a scenario where some organisms are doing well and others are not doing so well. And it's going to lead us right into this discussion on biodiversity and extinction. I've got two lessons, one small one on extinction. This one just kind of talking, but Biophilia is a book written by E.O. Wilson. You guys might have heard of him. He's kind of a famous guy, does a lot of outreach and speaking, and his books are written, you know, just kind of like a David Attenborough style. So they're kind of easy to, you know, meet the masses. You know, he argues in his book Biophilia that we are human in good part because of the particular way we affiliate with other organisms. They're a matrix in which the human mind originated and is permanently rooted, and they offer the challenge and freedom innately sought. To the extent that each person can feel like a naturalist, the old excitement of the untrammeled world will be regained. I offer this as a formula of reenchantment to invigorate poetry and myth. Mysterious and little-known organisms live within walking distance of where you sit. Splendor awaits in minute proportions. So basically encouraging people to engage with nature and biodiversity, you know, be aware of what's just around the block, right? So, you know, by definition, you know, is there a complete definition of biodiversity out there? Thinking about how would you guys define biodiversity?
Well, and there's lots of like diverse animal species around, you
Yeah.
know, whether that's like genetic or whatever.
Yeah, as you mentioned, it can be complex, right? There's lots of layers to biodiversity, the genetic diversity, the population diversity, right? Community diversity, right? It's the variety of life in all forms and all levels in organization, right? Everything is connected, just like we saw in that biophilia, we're connected to nature and so on, whether it be directly and indirectly, right? We eat because we have pollinators, right? And that's the big concern with the loss of the bees. So we put together, you know, well, this little, you know, this is a community, a forest community, marsh community, grassland community. You can see there's plants, there's birds, there's mammals, birds, you know, here's a reptile, plant, right? So it's a community. We know there's plants and animals, different species, and they associate with this particular habitat type, but they're not restricted to that particular habitat type. I'll just give the example, right, with the painted turtle. You find them very commonly in the marsh, right? They're going to be nesting in the banks of the marsh, in the mud. They're going to overwinter in the mud down at the bottom. But they will also travel up into the forest, right, for a different part of their life cycle. So there's all these interconnections. And so, you know, we have to be thinking about that as we move forward in preserving biodiversity, that they're oftentimes complex and that they're using, you know, multi-varied habitats, right? So there's all these levels of biodiversity: genetic, population, species, community, ecosystem, and landscape level. Again, stuff we've covered in general ecology, maybe even in some of your other classes. We're going to dig into some case studies on a few of them, but I'm going to walk us through those levels of diversity and maybe kind of in on our Thursday, I might give you guys a data set where we can kind of evaluate some genetic diversity on a population, or just kind of take a look at it, okay? So what comprises variation in the population's gene pool? Well, it's what's going on in the alleles. So again, thinking back to general ecology, alleles are different variants of the gene, right? We usually get an allele from mom and an allele from dad. Evolution is going to act at variability at the gene pool, allowing for speciation. And at the individual level, we have different alleles, okay? So what I want to make sure, you know, you're familiar with are some of these terms, just as a refresher, right? Heterozygous advantage is also known as heterosis, right? And you guys probably know that, you know, if you're homozygous for a gene, right, you're usually little a, or big A, right? You have the same allele. If the whole population that was surveyed has that, there's limited diversity, right? There's limited genetic diversity. So it's really important for a population to have some heterozygotes. And it changes their allele frequency and can allow them to adapt more readily, kind of in case there's a change, you know, in the environment pretty rapidly, or there's some kind of a disaster. Gene flow between populations, right? We want to have, you know, migration still occurring so that interbreeding and matings can occur and they're not isolated. Again, that fosters variation and heterozygosity. And genetic drift is a concerning thing, right? That's when these organisms get kind of isolated in different areas and no longer are interbreeding across these populations. So you can get a buildup of these kind of genetic anomalies. So here's one of the ways that we might look to measure genetic diversity in a population. And we're going to do this with an example with the bison. One measure of genetic diversity is level of polymorphism. I'm going to flip to the next page. The next one that you could measure is heterozygosity. Okay, so those are the things I want us to kind of be thinking about as we think about genetic diversity. So this is what a conservation biologist would do. They would probably be connecting, communicating with a molecular ecologist and a field biologist, right? They are gonna, you know, tag along maybe in the summertime, go out to the field. They're probably going to sedate some of these animals and draw blood. So they're going to be working with the field ecologists. And then the blood's going to get brought into a lab. They're going to isolate the DNA and they're going to evaluate the genes, okay? So they're working with the molecular ecologist. The level of polymorphisms, the percent of genes that are polymorphic, you know, having different morphs, right? Having some variation. So the alleles that we usually work with are the P and the Q, right? We code them in our model, P plus Q equals 1, right? The dominant allele P, the recessive allele Q, right? And, you know, we ideally want to have your P or your Q less than 0.95, right? Because if your P is 0.95, then your Q is 0.05, right? Because they have to add to 1. The higher one of your alleles is, in like all of your organisms, all the members of your population that you're surveying, the more likely that allele is fixed in the population, right? That there's no variation, right? That it's almost as if there is no Q allele, okay? And without that, without a change in allele frequency or the ability for it to change, you're gonna have a serious problem if, you know, there's climate change effects or a disease comes through, right? There's no variation for some to be the survivors, right? So if we don't have, you know, a P and a Q that are less than 0.95, so like a 0.4 and a 0.6 or a 0.5 and a 0.5 or a 0.3 and a 0.7, that's good, right? We know that there can be variation. There's room. There's not necessarily fixation for the Q and the P to go into extinction or vice versa, right? If we do get one of the alleles that's greater than a 0.95 in frequency, then we would consider it to be fixed. And if that allele is fixed, then that is a monomorphic gene. There's only one morph, right? It's become fixed in that population, and that's not a good thing. So what they did, again, they went out and they surveyed bison. They have bison A through E, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bison that they went and grabbed blood samples. And they went back in, isolated the genes, and so they looked at 24 genes in these bison to kind of see what the genetic diversity was. What's the level of polymorphism? And of those 24 genes, only one of the genes had some variation. Okay. And so they kind of went through and focused on that gene, and they coded it as X allele and Y allele. It's not a gender thing. I don't know why they chose X and Y, but say this could be like allele 1, this could be allele 2. Okay, so bison A got one of the alleles and then a copy of the other allele. Okay, so they were considered to be heterozygous when we look at them. Okay, bison B, same deal, heterozygous, got both represented alleles. Bison C doesn't have any of that X allele, has 2 representative of the Y allele. Okay, so they're a YY, they're a homozygous for 1. D, same deal, and then E was the opposite, right? Had that other allele and none of the others, okay? So this will allow us to figure out our P frequency and our Q frequency, all right? When you add up your alleles, okay, in this column, we had 4. In this column, we had 6 of the Y allele, okay? So there's 10 that we surveyed. And you'll notice that, you know, if 4 out of the 10 were X, then your frequency should be 0.4. And for the other allele, it's 1 minus the 0.4, or you can just say, you know, oh, there was 6 representative alleles that were Y out of the 10 total. So there's your 0.6, okay? So we end up with, you know, evaluating polymorphism in this particular gene, the MDH, right? This malate dehydrogenase that has a P of allele frequency of 0.4 and a Q of a 0.6. That's good, right? But it's kind of bad news too, because they evaluated 24 of these genes and all of them were monomorphic, right? So they're, you know, the only diversity that they're finding in these bison across those 24 genes is in 1 gene. So there's perhaps something going on with these bison, right? There's also an importance, you know, having rare alleles, even if they are kind of, you know, on the cusp, it's good, right? Because anytime you can increase that variability is good. Anytime you can get closer, away, well, a little bit more away from being monomorphic is good. Okay, so that's just something to consider. So that was, you know, how they evaluate polymorphism as a measure of genetic variability. So now let's take a look at heterozygosity, okay? And it's going to kind of play into what we just saw in that table. So we can measure heterozygosity as the percent of genes at which the average organism's heterozygous, the proportion of organisms in the population heterozygous for a gene, okay? So given what we just learned with the bison, right? 24 genes got surveyed. Only one of them we've determined was polymorphic, right? And that's what the outcome was. And so to evaluate your level of heterozygosity, we need to know how many heterozygotes there were, okay? So, you know, if we had only one that was showing up as, you know, the homozygous XX, that's not useful to us. We had 2 that were, you know, homozygous for the YY. And then we had 2, Rowan, can you please shut the door, please? And then we had 2 that were heterozygous. I just saved us. And so to figure out your level of heterozygosity, right, we've got 2, 4, 5, right? So 2 out of 5 were heterozygous, right? So you have a level of 0.4 heterozygous. Now to find out, like we set up here, average organism heterozygous, you take your 0.4, which is your level of heterozygosity for that MDH gene, and then you consider the level of heterozygosity for the other 23 genes. And we learned they were monomorphic earlier, right? So it would be 0, 0, 0, 0, all the way to 24, okay? And we divide it by 24 to get the average. So if we had, you know, 32 of the genes that we evaluated, only 1, you know, was showing up as heterozygous. Guys, I am teaching a class. My God, these children, I'm sorry, guys. So we'd have, we tack on a couple more zeros, and then you get your level of heterozygosity. So that's your level of heterozygosity observed, all right? If there were 3 genes that showed up as being polymorphic, we would do a similar calculation, and we'd have 3 of these, values, and then the rest would be zeros, and we would divide it by the 24. If you guys bother me one more time, there's gonna be trouble. Sorry, guys. Anyway, so that is our heterozygosity observed. And remember, we want to compare that to the heterozygous expected. Please shut the door. They're going to all be in trouble later on today. 2PQ, 2 times your P times your Q is the heterozygotes, right? And so to get your expected in Hardy-Weinberg, you would take what your P allele was, the 0.4, you would take what your Q allele was, the 0.6, multiply each of those by 2, and then divide it by your 24 genes, and you end up with a 0.02 expected. If you compare your heterozygous observed to your heterozygous expected, there's no statistical difference. There's no major statistical difference there. So it's suggesting that likely we're in a kind of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium scenario for the bison. Okay, which, when we think about evolution, and again, how there's a benefit to having that variability in the face of crisis and change, it's important to note those things. So again, that's how we can look at genetic diversity. We would have these collaborations. We could easily go through and kind of type them and get your polymorphic levels. And then we'd go in and look at our heterozygosity, okay? There's other terms to be familiar with: polygenic traits, epistasis. Human skin color is polygenic. So there's a couple of genes that are involved, but then there's also some environment involved. So again, we are more melanistic when we are closer to the equator. Your levels of melanin as a defense against cancer kind of increases, and we have darker skin, darker hues as we get closer to the equator because of the direct sunlight, right? So there's an environmental factor, but there's also a couple genes involved. That's what a polygenic trait is. It's a little bit more complex than typical Mendelian stuff that we usually cover. And then epistasis is, again, just kind of, a couple genes involved. The example is with dogs, like my dog. But when you look at the visual here, of the take-home message, you've got a B gene, you've got an E gene. One of them is for the color itself, and the other is for laying down the color, the deposition of the color. How much intensity of color will you be putting down, right? So that's what the B gene and the E gene will code. They work together, and all those different combos that you can see here result in these 3 different colors of these Labrador retrievers, right? So if you have 2 of each of those alleles and they're dominant, you're going to have a dark, black lab. If you have the E allele being the dominant and your B allele being your recessive, you're going to have a chocolate lab. And if you have, it doesn't matter for your B, but you're recessive on your E, you're going to have a white lab, like my dog would be, right? Okay, so again, 2 genes kind of working together. And there's bogs. So yeah, a little more complicated than our typical Mendelian work. All right, so genetics, genetic diversity and vigor, right? You guys probably are thinking, inbred organisms are probably going to have a harder hand at things, right? And that's what we see time and time again. High variability in genes, that's good. It allows for colonization of these interesting habitats that are, very heterogeneous. It also allows for, maintenance of coevolutionary, relationships. So the plant pollinator kind of relationships, the mutualistic relationships that are a little bit complex. All of that is helped when there's a lot of variability in the population's genes. Now, I cannot tell if that is a woodpecker on my house or the kids. Inbreeding. So inbreeding is bad news when it comes to the genetic variability, right? Loss of genetic variability in this population. You tend to have a loss of fertility. And there's a lot of examples of this out in nature. We're going to cover a couple things, but here's an example with, you know, the marmoset monkeys. They have fused labia, which results in kind of this reproductive isolation. They can't mate, and it's a function of them being inbred. We also have this picture right here of snow lotus. This snow lotus that's on the left is one that has been picked time and time again. You know, when you think of over harvesting and over hunting, poaching type things, there's people that do that with plants, okay? And so over time, this is a highly prized plant that's been harvested by, you know, many of these collectors, and its height has declined. You know, when we look at herbarium specimens, and it's been less fertile as a result. Over here on the right is a picture of one that hasn't been harvested. You can see how it looks quite different as a result and has a little bit more vigor. The same is true, you know, with inbred animals. You know, this is an example of a fish in a dammed area, okay? You can see how the damming, which is considered a disturbance, over time has isolated these organisms and changed the shape of their fins as compared to the wild type right here, right? And you can imagine that's going to impact. Because clearly it's not working. It's going to affect their, you know, survivorship and reproduction. Over here, we've got, you know, mammals and ungulates, primates, rodents, marsupials, elephant shrew. These are a whole bunch of mammals that are ranked. Looking at percent juvenile mortality, we're looking at those non-inbred versus those inbred, and you'll notice kind of across the board that those that are inbred are experiencing higher juvenile mortality. Excuse me 1 second. You're fine, Rowan. So we're looking here at genetic drift examples. This is where I'm going to kind of allow us to kind of digress for a minute and read something in a little handout, a real brief handout. So here we've got a picture of a beautiful cheetah, right? And they have experienced a bottleneck over a period of time. Remember, bottleneck was kind of a genetic drift thing where there was some kind of an environmental catastrophe that's reduced their population size down to something small. Founder effect, kind of, again, a genetic drift thing, but as a result of, you know, relocating to another area. Each one of these is going to result in them having fewer individuals and, you know, having inbreeding negative effects, right? So this is just a visual here, this table, that will show you how small population size due to genetic drift, maybe due to any of those kind of examples of genetic drift, will impact the genetic variation over time, over a period of 1 generation, 5 generation, 10, and 100, right? If you only had 2 individuals, you know, and you looked at their genes after 1 generation, okay, there's, you know, a little bit of variability here, right? We're under that 0.95. Over time, you see how quickly 2 individuals will lose genetic variation, right? So it drops very rapidly from 0.75, and then, you know, 4 years later, they're down at 0.24. And now after 10 years, they're at 0.06. If we look at, you know, 6 individuals, the drop is less rapid, but again, after your 10 years, you know, you're getting really low. As we creep up in number, right, you'll notice we hang on to genetic variation a bit longer. But again, over time, when we look long term, they're losing variation. And it's only when we get to about 100 individuals or more that things look a little bit better for these organisms. So again, we've always known having a larger sample size is better for organisms, right? It gives us more variation, we have less inbreeding, but it can happen really rapidly. The loss of genetic diversity can happen really rapidly, depending on your population size. So what I want us to do right now, you guys still with me? After me having to mum for a second there?
Yep.
Okay, is I'm gonna try and escape. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here, if possible. It's like frozen. Okay, and I'm gonna go back over here to our site. If you guys are on Moodle, I think most of you are. Go down to our area of biodiversity and extinction. Click on our link there. And go over here to the case study, red wolf and cheetah, okay? And I want you to click on that case study. And normally I hand these out to you guys in class, but because we aren't in class right now, I scanned it in using my phone this morning, so the quality is quite high. Oh no, it's sideways. What is going on? When I brought it in, it went sideways. Huh. Give me one sec, because I have it right here, and that's not how it looks to me. Hold on. That was a fail in turning it. I should have saved it as a PDF. Okay, so this is how it looks like to me. You guys, we can read it together actually here. I'm gonna just, I'll pause the, I'll make this bigger so you can see the words. But the first one here is the red wolf. In a couple slides, we get to red wolf, so that'll be on Thursday. But if I click over here, we're on the cheetah. So the cheetah's 2 slides worth. I will repost this as a PDF, so it's not sideways like that. But this is how it looks to me. So it must have just been a Google Drive upload transition. But let's take a moment together in the last minutes that we've got and read through this, just kind of seeing what's going on with the cheetah and their inbreeding. Can you see it?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. Anyone need more time on this slide? Can I advance?
Yeah.
Okay. So what are our take homes with these guys? What is happening to them physically that is kind of reflecting back on their genes? What are some of the big issues here?
You mentioned habitat loss, yeah.
Yeah, so they talked about habitat loss. They talked about predators. There's been a ton of focus and energy and monies, all these conservation groups, when they think about cheetahs, that's where they go. They want to enhance the habitat, give them more habitat, and remove the predators, right? That's where they've always been going. But what is it that we've learned in this discussion here, in this article, this take-home case?
It's a lot of inbreeding.
Yeah, there's massive inbreeding, that there's like no diversity, right? What did they say here? Given what we just kind of learned in our lesson with the bison, right? They have a P of 2%, an H of 0.0004. Here, I think it was up here, it was 0, polymorphism 0, heterozygosity 0. There's no genetic diversity in this group of cheetah, which suggests that they've been highly inbred for a long period of time. And that reflects back on their defective sperm, right? And the facial asymmetry that they're getting. So their bones are becoming deformed, and their ability to reproduce with abnormal sperm is declining. And then if anything does survive, there's low survivorship, right? The infant mortality is very high on these inbred individuals, which is all stuff that we kind of have talked about earlier. They did give some hope, right? There are some populations, the South African ones, right, that did have a bit of the allelic diversity, but it's still not much. So in general, the cheetahs are in trouble. And one of the ways that these researchers were able to evaluate that was with the skin grafts. That's kind of, seeing rejection on that, or the fact that it's not rejecting kind of gives you a sense of how different they are, right? Because it would reject kind of not something that they're not assuming is like their own tissue. So I don't know if that was surprising to some of you, but it was to me to know just how inbred they were, and how much of a problem it will be to kind of dig their way out of this. We'll learn in a few slides later, maybe it's even in the extinction one. There are scenarios with cats that were on the brink like this, that we've had some success stories. So kind of not all hope is lost, but this is a challenging case with the cheetahs. All right, so we are at time. Again, what I want us to be prepared for Thursday will be these readings, right? So I'm in the biodiversity section. These readings, I sent them to you in a link as well, with the person that is assigned. If you guys could pick which way you want to go, whether you want to do your PowerPoint handout or a Word document handout, make sure it's in the Dropbox so that we can present it that way. So we'll jump in on Thursday with me finishing up the lesson, and us having these discussion points. There's a really fun NPR clip here about the Guadalupe raccoon. And if time permits, I'd like for us to listen to it together so we can maybe see how our Thursday goes as we, think about what we can do in that time period. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right, don't forget, be pondering and really get pen to paper on your proposals, guys, okay? And for those of you that have that situated, stay tuned. In the next day, you'll be hearing back kind of with an okay from me so that you can get started on your annotated bibliographies. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right, thanks for your patience with the kids. Sorry, guys, this is mom life.
Not a problem.
All right, I'll see you Thursday.
Yeah,
Have a
have a
good
nice
one.
day.
Thanks.
Bye.
Okay.